My name is Debbie Lehman. I'm part of the program committee here at the library. Susan, back there on the camera, is the head of the committee, and we're happy to present Deborah Frontera as the author of Living on SISU. I heard it took 5 years to research.
5 years to write.
To research and write this book. She was a classroom teacher before this. We discussed the best way to get glue off the tables. And this summer marks the centennial of the 1913 copper strike. So I think it's pretty good timing for all of us. I know for a fact we don't have much in the children's room on this subject, so I'm going to be first in line buying a book. And it's a middle grade book, but I hear that it's more adults enjoy it, as many adults enjoy it as children do, and I love historical fiction myself. And I also saw on the book, Living on SISU, that it won first place for historical fiction.
Purple Dragonfly Award.
Purple Dragonfly Award from the Arizona authors. She lives in Texas part of the time, but in the UP, in that Keweenaw?
Yeah, in the Keweenaw.
And she grew up in the Keweenaw Peninsula. She is also, this is her author tour, her big tour. She's going to be at Engadine tomorrow at 3 o'clock, Cedarville, August 1st at 1, and Detour, August 1st at 6:30. I think we're very lucky to have her. I'm very excited about this.
I first got the idea to do this book in the summer of 2001 when the Restored Calumet Theater put on the locally produced opera, Children of the Keweenaw. And that got me kind of tuned back into what had happened back then, things that I had grown up hearing about as what happened, you know, back then, the strike, capital THE, the one and only, and began to look at the fact that there was so much good adult nonfiction and nothing for young people to read on a really important facet of Michigan history. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write a book that kids can read. Because of course when you have a kid's book, it doesn't mean adults can't read it. It just means kids can. And it's a matter of sentence length and vocabulary and choosing sentence structures and vocabulary that are child friendly. And I've wound up having literally ages 8 to 80 reading my book. And I had one elderly gentleman the first year it came out that picked it up. Ooh, big print! I can read this. And so I very quickly discovered that I had a huge adult audience as well. It did take me 5 years to do the research and the writing. I wanted to have a very thorough understanding of the whole thing and get it all inside my head so that I could put it back out through the eyes of my younger girl character. I got this costume made by a woman in Hancock whose small business was making any kind of costume for any event or any time period that someone wanted. And so she did the skirt and the top for me, and then I found a website called Vintage Hats and picked a very simple white hat that kind of looked like a lot of the other photos that I'd seen from that era. And then I actually had a different straw hat that had this little blue flower on it. And I took the flower off that old hat and attached it to this one so that I had something that was, you know, not vintage in its own age, but at least is somewhat authentic. And I am not wearing authentic footwear. I am in my nice, comfortable sneakers. I would not torture my feet with those high-button, high-heeled boots they wore back then. I'm kinder to my feet than that. But my own family history enters into Living on SISU a little bit. My grandfather, Louis Chester Pierce, was a mining engineer. He graduated from Michigan Tech back when it was called the Michigan College of Mines. He and my grandmother were married in 1904, and he hauled her off to the mining camps in Mexico, where she found herself living in a dirt floor house. And she had gone off with her trousseau of all of these, long walking skirts and everything. And she very quickly discovered that the trains tended to sweep up fleas and other little unwanted six-legged creatures onto the legs of the wearer. And she was a bit of a rebel for her day. She cut off all her skirts to a terribly unfashionable ankle length and got rid of her problem. Later, I did find out that she also was active in the suffragette movement. So, I had quite an interesting grandmother. Two of the characters in the book, Chester and Jessie Edwards, I changed the last name for fiction's sake, are patterned after my grandparents. Once my grandfather had his fill of the mining camps in Mexico, they came back to the Copper Country region, and he went into business with his father and brothers, and they had this whole chain of retail stores and several different things they were involved in. But my grandmother also hired young women to come and work for her, and she would train them in proper housekeeping and in etiquette, help them with their English skills if they needed it. And she went through one entire family of sisters from an Idema family that lived out in Trap Rock Valley. So the fact that my characters, Chester and Jessie Edwards, take in my young character and have her work for them is again patterned after my grandparents. And I also knew that my grandparents had a stillborn child in the first couple of years they were married, and then were childless all the way until 1920 when my mother showed up as a rather late life miracle. So that entered into my characters a little bit too. I also found out that my great aunt, my grandfather's brother's wife, was in Calumet Christmas Eve 1913 delivering charity baskets the evening of the Italian Hall tragedy. So there were just several different family connections that went on with the book, and I thought, this is how I need to do this, and I wanted to tell you that yes, my own story comes into it in a lot of ways. One of the other things that I get a kick out of with these skirts, I don't know how women managed back then. I truly don't. In the other book that I did on that period, the photos of John William Nera, there's a photo in here of two young women riding bicycles wearing these skirts. I don't know how they did it. I truly don't know how they did it. But there were a lot of people along the road who helped me with that. This is one very wonderful lady. This picture was taken in 1993, and this is Mrs. Mary Boutin. She was 97 years old at that time, still had all of her memories. She was 8 years old in 1913, and she was at the party at the Italian Hall and still remembered all of it vividly and told me exactly what her mother said, which was something like this: "I don't smell no smoke, you stay right here or I'll thrash you." Well, guess whose mom says that in my fictional account? There were so many things about her account that wound their way into my telling of that terrible tragedy. And also, having read the transcript of the coroner's inquest, where I had all of the witness statements that I could filter through my mind and really try to get a picture in my mind of what it was like to be in that building that night. Mary Boutin also shared with me other aspects of her childhood. What school was like, what her friends were like, what they did for fun, what kind of games there were. All those kind of things that make any book more real, because you can tell what your character is doing, not just at the exact time in history, but what life was like growing up back then. The fact that yes, they did have the silent movies, and they went to them and they would laugh at the Keystone Cops, and there as always there was a bully at school, and there was the one family who raised the pig, and another who had the cow, and another who had a few chickens, and you traded some of your pork for the chickens, for the ustua, neighbors traded with each other and not added to their income, but made their spending go farther by trading products with their neighbors. So a lot of those things entered into the book and into what my character has to do. One of the biggest problems that I ran into in researching was bias in secondary sources. Like this book here, Big Annie of Calumet, was 100% pro-labor. It's a wonderful story of a labor struggle, and it's nonfiction, and it gave me a lot of background about Annie Clement, who does interact with my character, but it's very slanted toward labor. This one, on the flip side, Calumet, Copper Country Metropolis, was all written from the Daily Mining Gazette. Well, newspapers, if they want to make money, have to have advertisers, and they have to please their advertisers, or their advertisers don't buy ads with them, and there goes their income. So this book had the opposite slant. It was very pro-business, pro-management. And I found myself thinking, polar ends of the scale, about like watching CNN versus Fox and Friends. You know, you have to be aware of that bias. No matter what kind of research you're doing, you have to figure out what the slant is and whose side you're on, and try to read enough different sides that you can come together in the middle, because the truth is somewhere in the middle. And I ran into so much bias in various sources that I actually gave that problem to my character. She's reading Taiomies, which was the Finnish labor newspaper, and she's reading the Daily Mining Gazette and wondering how two newspapers who are supposed to tell the truth are telling such different versions of the same events, and wondering, you know, what to believe and who to listen to and how to filter through all of that and try to make sense of it. So I gave that problem to her too. Other things entered from my own experience. How many of you ever turned your back to the wind when walking in a blizzard because you didn't want to freeze your face off? Emma walks backward in the blizzard. Another thing that was really interesting, growing up in Lake Linden, which is 4 miles down the hill from Calumet and Laurium, we had little shortcuts all over town, down this alley, through somebody's backyard and on, you know, just short ways to get around town. And when I wanted to find out how long it would take from Emma's supposed residence in Swedetown to get over to Laurium, I consulted historical maps because I knew very well the 6th Street extension wasn't there then. And I looked at historical maps and plotted out on a modern map which streets I would have to take to walk there. And then I parked one car on Kearsarge Street in Laurium and had my husband drive me to the top of Swedetown Hill, and he thought I was nuts. And I said, just humor me. Just drop me off right here, this corner. Okay, you know. And then I walked that prescribed path, and it took me 40 minutes. And I thought, okay, now I know how long it's going to take Emma to get from her house to the place where she's going to go to work. And then I started thinking about those shortcuts. And I had this neat little book that I had found in a used bookstore. It's a little history of Swedetown. It even had a map in it and lists of who owned what particular house. I mean, it's like 3 blocks by 3 blocks and the whole thing. But it had the names and the addresses and who lived there and what years they lived there. I suppose taken out of census information. But I thought, holy moly, wow, this is a nice find. You know, 3 Niemi families right there in Swedetown. Guess what my character's last name is going to be? You know, and the fact that it showed in a little map, you know, where the cow pasture had been, where the school was, all that, so that I could make her home really realistic. And so I figured there had to be a shortcut across the fields, maybe through and between the mine shafts. There had to be a shortcut. But I could not find any historical evidence that there was one. So I thought, okay, I'm just going to stretch this point because this is historical fiction. You can stretch the truth just a little bit. So So I talked about finding the shortcut. And then when I was doing a book signing in Calumet, a man came up to me and he said, I read your book, I live in Swedetown. Darn, you even nailed the shortcut. And I went, yeah, I nailed the shortcut. So yes, it did exist. But that was one of those little things where, you know, as a historical fiction writer, you stretch it just a little bit and you go with what's most likely to have happened. And so all of that, I just had a really lot of fun doing it. And I also, when I was walking around Swedetown, I saw one of those little salt box mine company, you know, company houses that I could see had never been remodeled in any way at all. I mean, it was the original. And there was a car in the driveway. So I got out my gutsy feeling, and I just walked up to the door and I knocked on the door, and the young man answered it, and I told him who I was and what I was doing. I said, would you mind terribly if I just walk through your house? I just kind of want to see, you know, what the view is out the window, and, you know, as part of my research. He says, yeah, sure, come on in, you know. So I walked up this little itty bitty narrow flight of stairs, and I looked at these two tiny little bedrooms in the upstairs, and the house was like right across the street from the position that I had imagined my character's house to be. So I looked out that window, and yep, you could see the cow pasture and the forest beyond. So even little things like that, and my friends in Houston could not believe I could walk up to a total stranger's house and knock on the door and ask to go in. Weren't you afraid? No, it's the Upper Peninsula. It's just, people are different there, you know. She was just totally amazed. I just couldn't convince her that I had not the least worry about knocking on a stranger's door's house. And that was another thing when we were working on the book. I had the title picked out, Living on SISU. Does anybody not know what SISU means? Okay, it's a Finnish word. It has no exact English translation. It takes about 20 words to describe it. I call it true grit with grace. Another friend of mine says when you run out of determination and fortitude, SISU takes over if you have it. And if you don't have SISU, you give up or die. And none of us would be here if our ancestors hadn't had a good bit of SISU, whether you're Finnish or not. So my original title was just Living on SISU. And then my editor, in going through the book and knowing what else I had written, which, you know, my first fiction was this little futuristic piece called The Chronicles of Henry Roach Derrier, in which humankind are extinct and the world has been taken over by intelligent insects. And she says, Deb, people might look at your title like this and think you're talking about another planet. And I said, well, UP is kind of another planet in some ways. She said, we need a subtitle. You know, she said, this title can be very confusing to a lot of people, and you're not just going to be selling this in the Upper Peninsula. So then we worked on it, and we came up with the title, you know, the 1913 Union Copper Strike Tragedy, so that people would know what we were talking about. Another interesting bit of research in doing it is when we were doing the cover. This was the first version of the cover before we had that little discussion about the subtitle. And I knew from the first time I saw the photograph, I knew I wanted that photograph on the cover. The photo was in the 1913 strike file at Michigan Tech Archives. And I saw that photo, and she came. I totally tuned out them. I zeroed in on her, and that look on her face like, what terrible thing could possibly happen today? And whenever I needed to get inside Emma's head, I looked at that picture, and even though nobody knows who the young woman is, she became Emma in my mind. And to me, that was how Emma looked. Then, once we knew we needed the subtitle, then we added that and highlighted a little bit more with the yellow. And for me, when I saw it with more yellow, I called up my editor and I said, that's the cover, just like that. I said, the yellow is the hope. Because you have this black and this white and all of this really terrible stuff going on that year. But then you've got that little bit of yellow, and that's the hope that people carried, especially young people carried out of that whole experience. So that all blended in, and whenever you're writing, whenever somebody is doing a book, there's this huge process to get the right cover. And people like to say, you know, don't judge a book by the cover, but we do. People do judge a book by a cover, and it's got to draw you in immediately and make a person want to come and pick that book up and open it and want to read it. So that was how the cover came about, and I was glad that it worked out that way. I was very lucky to meet a lot of people, and in one of those people, who's no longer in the area now, I want to kind of show you, this is a page out of my messy notebook that I kept all my research in. Abby Sue Fisher was the archivist at the Keweenaw National Historical Park Archives, which at the time I was researching wasn't even open to the public, but she agreed to let me come in, and I got to actually hold in my hands several of the union books from the men, because they had to turn their union book in if they wanted to go back to work for Calumet and Hecla. And here was this little box of union books. And I'm holding these and again looking at the names, and it's okay, character name, character name, character name. But there was both a 1913 and a 1914 calendar in the union books. So I took out my notebook and I wrote down all of the Sundays, because once you have one day of the week, you can build a whole calendar off of it. And then in my notebook, I had, you know, this was July, Wednesday, 16, 17, 18, and whenever I was reading in a nonfiction source and it mentioned a specific date, I would go down like right here, R&R, that was for Rebels on the Range, 40, 41, and 42, page numbers of something that happened on Monday, July 21st. And every time I would find an actual date, I would put it on my calendar, and then as I was writing and I came to that date and okay, what's going to happen with Emma today, I would go pull all those sources back out, reread them, get it fresh in my mind again, and then write the scene from Emma's point of view. And of course, you know, some days there wasn't anything in particular going on, so those were the days that I would fill in with what was happening with their friends, or you know, how they were playing baseball that afternoon. And those were the days when I would fill in other information that was true to the times, and then get that story flowing so that it wasn't just the strike, it was also Emma as a 12-year-old girl living and working and trying to help her family through that year. But that system worked out really well for me, and of course it was messy looking, but I was the only one that had to read that, so it didn't matter. And other things that, the one other scene that was absolutely the most difficult, of course, was the scene of the Italian Hall disaster. And I had almost the whole book written except for that scene. I read through everything again. I went back through the coroner's inquest. I went back through all my sources. I went back through what Mary Boutin had told me, reread my notes from our interview, and I just didn't know how in the world Emma was going to tell that scene. And I kept putting it off and putting it off. And then I realized Emma didn't want to deal with it, and neither did Emma's creator. And so, and this was about 2006. I was still teaching full-time then. So I took that week between Christmas and Christmas and New Year's, because I was home all day, every day. And I made an appointment with my computer. And I told my family, leave me alone. I have to write this scene. And I sat myself down in the chair and I said, write it. Because I knew I had to do it. And then I spoke through Emma's father and had him tell Emma, you know, life goes on, you got to move on, you know, write it down, get it out. So I let it flow, just total stream of consciousness. And I began to realize that when you're really stressed out and you're in a not quite panic mode, but that just after the panic mode, your mind kind of jumps around from one thing to another. Oh yes, that there was, yes, but wait a minute, I forgot that. And instead of putting things right in time order as they would have happened, I let Emma be scatterbrained. And I let it jump from 1 minute back to this, and oh, now I'm avoiding it again. And I let her go back and forth. And I just poured the scene out. About 2 weeks later, I took it to my critique group. This was about 5 authors, and we were all working on different stuff, sharing our chapters with each other and telling each other, oh, this part's really good, that dialogue's good, but that page, you need to work on that some more. And we were all doing this with each other, and I read them the scene, and they all went, and then they said, don't change a word of it. That's the only scene I've ever written that wasn't extensively rewritten. All I did was correct the spelling and the punctuation, and I just let it be. And it worked, and I thought, I hope I never, ever, ever have to write a scene like that again, because it was just so gut-wrenching to try to write it from first person and make it real and make my readers feel the panic and feel all these emotions as this young woman loses her best friend and doesn't know where she is and everything is just turning to chaos around her. And I had never actually been in that situation, so it took a little bit more imagining. But I was just crying when I finished the scene, and you know, then my family said, "Okay, are you done with it?" Yep, I'm done. So, but the whole book kind of fell together in that way, and I felt like I had lived Emma's life by the time I finished with it. Other things that I've done since then, this one here, this one came about as a result of living on SISU. I found out that almost all of the photos that I wanted to include in living on SISU were John William Nera photos. And then I remembered, I know that family. John William Nera's grandson, Dr. Robert Nera, I used to babysit his kids when I was 15. And he and my parents had been friends for many years, so I took Bob a copy of the manuscript and I said, hey, I'm using a bunch of your grandfather's photos that are over at Tech in this, and I just want you to know what I'm doing with it. And he came back to me after reading the manuscript. He said, I love what you're doing. He said, how would you like to do a book on my grandfather's photography? And I said, sure. So I got to work with 300 and something photos in Michigan Tech Archives with his blessing and the archive's blessing. And the first thing I did was ask them for photocopies of every single one of them so that I could take them home and mull them over outside of archive hours. And I would stack and restack and sort and resort until I had an organization, people, places, and the way the book ended up. And then I would take those stacks and I'd spread about 20 photographs over my queen size bed and say, okay, 20 photos here, you can have 5. 6 at the outside. Which 6? And I'd pick up 6 and I'd look at the rest and I'd put those down. And I just kept mulling around with them until, I don't know, maybe something spoke to me and said, okay, these are the 6 that can speak for this whole group. Sometimes it was easy, like the building of the South Range Railroad. I just took one from each phase. I took one photo from clearing the trees, one from laying the track, one from banking a trestle, and then one of the train running on the tracks. That was easy, but some of the others, portraits. Okay, do I take the bride and groom or do I take this really cool wrestling guy? You know, with all his muscles that he probably didn't get. He was probably a wrestler part-time and pushing tram cars 10 hours a day to get the muscles. And, you know, some of those decisions were really tough, but had to be made. Both of those then prepared me for the work that I did on this. This was last summer's project. 4 solid 40 hours plus every week from June to the beginning of October in Finlandia's archives, putting together a history of the school from the 1890s, the days of the dream of Suomi Opisto, to this past year's graduating class. I put together the entire first draft, and then I really had to go back to Houston and earn a paycheck. And turned the whole thing over to Karen Johnson, the marketing specialist for the university. And then she took my draft, shaped it up, found a few more pictures. She actually did the last 2 chapters because she was on site to take those pictures of this year's graduating class while I was spending 3 days a week teaching creative writing to 2nd graders in minority classrooms for Houston's Writers in the Schools program, a really, really cool gig. But so I was back in Houston, and then she finished it up, so we went in as co-authors on the project. This one I don't have copies with me. You got to get this one through Finlandia or through Northwind Books in Hancock. And the hardbound version should be back by now, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I know they were supposed to get the hardback copies in the end of July, and it's the end of July. But whether it ended up on schedule, I'm not sure. But all of those things, it's the digging that's the work. You find the people who are the resources. You find the documents you need, and it takes a lot of time and hours to dig out the first-hand documents. It's easy to read somebody else's book, but then you get back into the bias issues again, and knowing, okay, how much of the story did this person leave out in their nonfiction? And so that's why it's good to get back to the original documents and compare those and just see where you are and then see which way it takes you. A lot of other people gave me good advice too, including a cousin of mine, Bill Backus, who has a dairy farm in the Trap Rock Valley. I called him up late in the evening one day because I knew if I called at 5 or 6 o'clock he was out milking the cows. And I said, Bill, how long does it take to make a calf? My little family has a cow, and I know they have to breed it once a year or they aren't going to get milk. I didn't know that much. And he said, same as a person, 9 months. And then he started telling me about how they would, about 6 weeks or so before the calf was born, they would stop milking the cow. And then they would wait 3 or 4 weeks afterward to make sure the calf had enough milk before they begin taking milk for the family again, and that process was called freshening. And of course my cousin has a whole herd of dairy cows, and he's got a calendar for each one. And he told me that one time he got 2 calendars mixed up, and he milked one cow right through birth. He said, it's kind of hard on the cow, but she turned out okay. And I filed that in the back of my mind. I didn't know how I was going to use it until I was writing that scene after the Italian Hall disaster, and Emma is drinking some hot milk, and it suddenly occurs to her, why are we drinking hot milk? Aren't we freshening Daisy right now? And her brother says, well, we're all making a sacrifice. Daisy got to do her part too because they needed the milk. You know, and all of a sudden that little fact just fell right into place in the perfect point. So, you know, it was my cousin. There was a girlfriend of mine, a Finnish descent, whose last name I used. Her maiden name was Lampa. And I said, you know, do you know how long your great-grandfather was farming in Trap Rock? Do you know if they were there at that time? Yes, they were. Can I use your last name? Sure, go ahead. So my character's brother goes to work for this farmer named Lampa and works for him all summer and brings home for his pay the family supply of onions and potatoes and hay for their cow for the winter. fair trade, another thing that people did back then. And Nancy and I were having coffee one morning, and she was making used to it. And I said, Nancy, I'm going to get my notebook. Tell me everything you do to make this. And so she's telling me this, and I'm watching her, putting her fingers through as the curds are forming and pouring it through the cheesecloth, and I'm writing this whole thing down. And of course that turned into a scene between Emma and her mother when Emma's mom decides it's time for Emma to learn how to do this. And so, friends, cousins, lots of historical people within the copper country, one that I could call and say, what is absolutely the most common Cousin Jack name? And he said, Richards. I said, good, that's my bully's last name. Because then nobody can say it's their ancestor, because there were 40 of them listed in the phone book. Or not actually the phone book, they were directories with names and addresses, because not that many people had telephones then. And I had been going through the what they were called the Polk directories at MTU archives. So all of those little things went together to make my readers feel like they're right there on the street with Emma. And that was my goal. And I cannot tell you how wonderful it was when I found out that I was a finalist for the Purple Dragonfly Awards, and then flew out to Phoenix in November of 2010 and heard my name announced first place, and I'm going, and it was suddenly so worth it. I gotta show you one neat little thing. We've just gone into a second printing, and on the first print run, I had to hand place all the stickers announcing first place. And every time I opened up a box, I had to take all of them out, put stickers on every single one of them, and then put them right back in the case, because a lot of times I would ship a whole case at a time to a distributor. Now, the organizers of the Purple Dragonfly Award gave me the PDF file of the award, and the woman who designed the original cover imported it right into the design, so no more stickers. It's really nice to be in a second print run and not to have to pull every single book out of the box and put a sticker on it every time I'm getting ready to send them out or go to an event. So that was really just kind of a cool bonus in that. Let's see, I want to go through and see if there's anything else. Oh, this is something that will amuse you. One of my friends who was reading through it said, Deb, she's writing this in her best English, right? I said, yep. She said, the way she's taught in school, right? Yep, that's right, Diane. Back then, they would never, ever, ever have started a sentence with and, but, or so. Perfectly acceptable today. It sure wasn't then. And I said, my gosh, Diane, you're right. So I had to go back through the entire manuscript and change every single one. Like here, put a comma in, took that one out and just said, I wonder if I had to break up the sentences or tie them together. If the sentence was too long, I needed to remember my readability level, and then I would break it into two sentences and get rid of the and, the but, or the so. And if they were pretty short, then I would put the comma or the semicolon in. And I had to go through the entire manuscript doing that. I couldn't believe how many times I had started a sentence with a conjunction and worked through the whole thing again. It was just one of those neat things. Another one was coming up with the map in the back, because I did want to market it outside of the Upper Peninsula. I had this map, which shows Portage Lake, Houghton and Hancock, Lakeland and Calumet and Lorien, way too detailed, and it didn't show the whole peninsula. And I had found this one in one of the mining things. It was the right size, but it was a map of the different ranges, and it had a lot of technical stuff about, whether it was the Pewabic lode or all of this stuff that was just kind of going right over my head. But it was just exactly the right size, showed the whole peninsula, and so I traced it, because you can't just copy a map, they are copyrighted, I traced it, and then I put in the details that I wanted, and I numbered them, different locations and things like that, and then I put the larger in with, you know, showing what was enlarged, so people had a sense of where the heck this little finger is. And it was pretty rough looking, but when I gave the list of numbers and that to the graphic designer, because they're the ones that are good at this, then they came up with what ended up in the book, and it looks nice and professional. And the circles that are on there were when I was proofreading that page, I realized that the graphic designer had made a couple of errors, and those had to go back and, you know, we had to go back and correct those errors. And no matter how many people you have read through something, you still miss things. In the first print run, after it had gone to print, after I had gotten back, I was writing the teaching materials to go with it, and a fourth grade teacher friend of mine who was helping me, she said, "Debbie, did you realize you spelled Ishpeming wrong?" You know, I made it Ishpeming instead of Ishpeming, and probably nobody outside of the UP would notice that, but people up here sure noticed it, and I said, "Yep, my fault." I thought I had checked it, and the final proofreader thought I had checked all of the page, you know, place names, so she didn't check it, and it slipped right on through. And there were a couple of other little things too that we cleaned up in the second print run. So there will be little tiny differences like that between the two versions, but it was a labor of love working on it, and after that 5 years and then getting it off the press and getting the award, it was like, yes, that was really worth it, especially when I got an email from a woman who bought it for her granddaughter and then decided to read it herself first, and then caught herself writing in the margins, "This is like your great uncle so-and-so. This is what happened to great-great-grandma," whoever it was, and sent me this long, detailed email saying, "Thanks for making this so realistic, because it's just like my family." And those are the little intangible things that make 5 years of work worth it. Do want to open it up a little bit to questions from you. Yeah.
I was just curious if your publisher's Northland Press.
No. I actually worked with some grant money through a small press in Houston, not very far from where I live, so the editor and I could get together very frequently. So ABC's Publishers is the original publisher. They have since gone out of business, so the second print run is all mine again. All my rights and everything reverted back to me when they went out of business, and so now it's the same as being self-published again.
Did you write the grant?
Yeah. I knew of a person who had some grant money available and who was interested in local history and in promoting local history. So it was kind of a private grant sort of thing, and they prefer to remain anonymous. So you know, I'm not going to say where, but it was that kind of an arrangement, and it didn't cover all of the costs. I shared the costs with the publisher. You know, I had the grant money, the publisher put in some, and together we put it together. So does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, Frontier, I realize that's not your given name, but you know, we always talk about the Finnish thing. Were there many Italians that lived in that area?
Yes, there were. I mean, the Christmas party was held in the Italian Hall.
When you said the Italian.
Yeah, there were a lot of Italians. There were a lot of many different ethnic groups up there. One statistic that I found, in the 1910 census figures, Calumet Public Schools reported students from 40 different countries. It's just amazing the huge variety of immigrants that went to that region for jobs in the copper mines. So yes, there was a large Italian hall, and my husband is Italian. He's a troll though. I let him be an honorary Uber. Any other questions?
You were talking about I think it was the union book,
Uh-huh.
and was that just something everybody had?
If you
or-
were a union member, it was a little book. It looked like a little bank book. You remember back before computer days when you had a little pass book, and they would stamp it every time you made a withdrawal. You know, and you saw the whole record there. They were about 2.5 by 3.5 inches. Had 8 or 10 pages in them, enough for, marking down every month when they paid their dues and things like that. It was really a fascinating little thing to see and hold in my hands. Kind of touch that part of the past.
Mhm.
Oh, another interesting thing, this just happened last Wednesday when I was at the Calumet Library. A woman came up to me afterwards and she said, "You've got to come with me afterwards. You have to meet somebody." She had been doing a display on Annie Clement, Big Annie, for the centennial of the strike. And in doing her research, she had found Big Annie's great-granddaughters and had made contact with them and brought them up to the Copper Country for this big dedication thing. And after my library program was over, I went to the restaurant with her where she was meeting them for dinner and got to sit down and talk to these younger, wonderful young women. I don't know, probably in their upper 30s now, little kids. They had little kids with them, their own children, about the age of my daughters, actually, I think. And just meet them, and they were totally unaware that they were related to this really famous person. Because when Annie Clement left the Copper Country when the strike was over, so guilt-ridden over what had happened in the Italian Hall and all of the children dying, so dumping that load of guilt on herself when it wasn't her fault, she left the area, she went down to Chicago. Her husband divorced her, and she married the reporter that had been kind of romancing her throughout the whole strike. And he was from Chicago and was doing all of the articles for the Chicago papers. She married him. They had one daughter, but she never, ever spoke of the strike or what had happened to her. It was like she put the whole thing out of her mind, carved out a new life for herself, never told her daughter, who of course never told the granddaughters. And so when census figures and things pointed to these two young women, one of them actually had a whole bag of photographs. And she always wondered, who is this? This is someone's family. This looks important. Never threw it out, but never knew who it was. So they were learning about their great-grandmother for the first time and coming up for the dedication. It was really, really neat to give both of them a hug and, give them copies of my book for their kids and, keep that tradition alive. And I almost forgot about that because it's so recent and all the driving lately has kind of got my brain scrambled. Any other questions?
Could you tell us about the Italian Hall?
Okay, on the first floor, there was the stairway that went up to the banquet hall, and there was a bar and a little like grocery store that were the first floor. The upstairs was this meeting hall. There was a stage. The photos in the book really showed a pretty good idea. The stairwell was about this wide and straight up, and then there was a little vestibule area at the top, and then one door that went into the banquet hall, and then a hallway to where there were bathrooms and some other things. And in the panic, the best of what people can figure out now is that when the cry of fire went out, and you have a room with 500 people in it, and over 400 of them are children, and you have this panic, and everybody's running for the door at the same time. One person trips, and another trips over them, and somebody else tries to jump over the two of them to get out the door. And that was kind of what happened. There was this tumble down the stairs of people trying to get out, and those who were on the bottom were crushed to death. And when the firemen arrived to find there was no fire, they actually could not pull people out from the bottom. They had to go up the fire escape and take people from the top down. So that, but the room itself was, probably like that end of your library there. It wasn't a real huge room, but it was good sized. It would hold 500 people. They were crowded, but there was room to walk around and move in it. So, I hope I answered your question with that. And you had another
Yeah, I was
question.
gonna say, that weekend, this Christmas weekend, sounded like it was a real catharsis that you went through. Did you reimagine you were in the place?
I tried to. I really did try to. I tried to put myself inside Emma and tell it like she might have experienced it.
Mhm.
And with not ever having gone through a panic situation, but have been through other things, going through fire drills with my classrooms and, telling them how to get down and put their hands over their heads and things like that, because we had drills like that regularly when I was teaching. But just imagining some of those and thinking, okay, what would happen if there really were a panic and you're not at your best, and then kind of filtering all that through and letting it flow.
Has that kind of stayed as a part of your psyche, Is that,
I think it has.
Yeah.
I really think it has. I know I don't think the same about the events or the people. When I've gone back since to the site where the Italian Hall used to be and just sat on one of the little benches in that Memorial Park and just, filtered it through again, it feels like it's part of me now.
Have you ever run across any other authors who have done that same sort of thing in some tragedy?
I've run across one or two that have had similar experiences, and we've all said, it's just really hard to go through that. And of course, anybody who writes historical fiction, you've got to get into the minds of your characters. Even, look at Gone with the Wind. That's historical fiction, and how fabulously that author portrayed that, and then it moved into the movie so that we all feel like we watched Atlanta burn. So yeah, it's, a lot of people feel that. At least the ones that, the historical fiction that you remember because you really felt like you were there, that author probably went through it. Yes?
I remember growing up, living close to that area, and being told that there was always the thing that they said the doors went in.
Yeah.
And I see where you had the book Death's Door, and then they said they
Yeah.
hadn't really found that the doors weren't that
Right,
way.
yeah. Steve Leto and I were both doing research at the same time, and the photo is very, very clear that the doors opened outward. But you can still run into some really diehard people in Calumet, and you can show them the photo, and they're going to still know the doors opened in. The doors opened in. They won't even look at the photo. It's so ingrained in their mind that because that's what we grew up with. And, this was another really neat book that I found too. This Tall Annie, a biography, and this one is now back in print. They've revived it. I found a used copy of it to do my research. But I borrowed some stuff from her too, especially the scene where we talked about the snow getting deep enough to jump out of the second story windows into the snow, and I borrowed that. And then other resources, I had this little pamphlet put out by the Downtown Association in Calumet of all the different historic churches, and I studied them to figure out which church my little family would have gone to. And I had to figure out what the differences between the different brands of Lutheranism, the apostolics versus the evangelicals versus, and I grew up Methodist and converted to Catholicism, so, it was like, oh, jeepers, the Lutherans had their arguments too, So all of those things went into it because I had to be accurate in that. You want to be accurate. Because the minute you're not, somebody's going to find it and tell you about it. you know? So, I think we're probably about out of time, so if there's nothing else, I'll just kind of shut this down and sign a few books for those of you who are interested, or in any of my other books too, for that matter. I have a whole bunch of them. So, thank you so much for being here.